Hello, this is the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee. My name is Carol McCoy. I will be interviewing Martha Trammel. Today's date is June 4th, 2018 at 96 Victoria Park, Nashville, Tennessee. This interview, as I mentioned, is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. Hello, Martha.
Hi.
Would you please introduce yourself with your full name, your date and place of birth?
Martha Johnson Trammel. My place of birth is Montgomery, Alabama. Date of birth, February 20th, 1947.
And would you tell us a little bit about your grandparents, your parents, and what your father did? I know, but I think you should tell us when they were born, where they were born, and what were their business or professional interests, what were their political and community ties, and their community interests.
Okay. My grandparents, I'll start with my grandparents. My maternal grandparents were, one was born in Canada, the other in Iowa. My maternal grandmother was first-generation Norwegian. She spoke Norwegian before she spoke English. And my grandfather was born in Canada, but came to the United States as a young man. And they met in Minnesota. After losing a child, they moved to Tennessee.
What were their names?
Oh, their names were Gertie and Webster Hill. They lost their first child, and the memories were so hard that my grandmother did not want to stay on the farm in Minnesota where the accident happened. And they moved to property in Tennessee that my grandfather had purchased some years before at a railroad auction. So my mother and her family grew up in Etheridge, Tennessee, and they farmed, primarily dairy farming, but the general things that went along with farming. My father's parents, my paternal grandfather was a physician, and he was born and raised in Alabama.
What was his name?
His name was Arthur Johnson. Okay. My paternal grandmother was born in South Dakota, although she grew up in Indiana. And for reasons I've never really known, she came to Central Alabama. She was hired as a milliner. She had trained as a milliner, a hat maker, after she finished high school, and was hired by a dry goods store in the town that my grandfather lived in. So they met and married.
What was her name?
Her name was Mabel Hall, and they lived in Clanton, Alabama, a small town in roughly the geographic center of the state of Alabama, where my father was born and grew up. My father was also a physician. He got his medical degree, his college and medical degrees at Vanderbilt. And while he was in medical school, he met my mother, who had become a nurse, having trained at St. Thomas Hospital. And they met and married in Rochester, New York, after he had completed medical school, where he was doing his internship in the relatively early 40s. He had a period of military service during the Second World War. They lived in California for a while, and eventually he was stationed in Alaska. Was there when the war ended, although my mother had come back to Tennessee because Alaska was considered a post to which a spouse could not go. And after the war was over and he was discharged from service, they moved back to Alabama, where he grew up, where he started medical practice in his father's old office.
Now, when was your father born? What date?
My father was born in 1919.
And your mother?
My mother in 1921.
Okay. And besides being the physician for Clanton, Alabama. Did he have any other business activities or business concerns?
If you want to call a hobby farm a business concern, then he did that. It was more of a diversion for him. But for a number of years, he owned a farm that raised beef cattle. And it was our kind of our second home out in the country.
And did he have any political or community activities that he was real involved in, or your mother?
My mother was on the county library board. She also was a Girl Scout leader, although not, unfortunately, when I was that age, but when my sister was Girl Scout age. My dad was not terribly involved in community activities. He was, of course, a member of the medical association in the county, and he was not politically involved. His interests, he was very interested in education, a very big believer in education at all levels, including public education at the elementary and secondary school levels. He had actually gone to a private high school, a military academy, during the Depression. And while he felt he got a good education there, he felt that it was not terribly representative of life. And he really did not want his children to end up in private high schools.
So how did that play out for you when you were little? Looking at your childhood, where did you go to school?
I went to Clanton Elementary School and to the Chilton County High School in Clanton,
memories?
Alabama, both public schools.
You have any favorite memories of those early years in school?
I remember some teachers that were particularly good, and both schools were relatively small. I think we had in our high school graduating class perhaps 80 to 85 students. It was a small school.
And where were you ranked in your high school when you graduated?
I was pretty near the top.
I think so. You play the piano. When did you start taking piano lessons?
I started when I was in elementary school, perhaps 5th grade. I don't remember exactly.
Okay. As a young person, elementary school, junior high, high school, what were some of your favorite activities, and who were some of the friends that you remember?
Well, favorite activities, of course, I loved music and still do. Summers were really kind of a nice, relaxing time. We swam a lot, and then we spent time at the farm. As a teenager, a couple of summers, my dad would have my brother and me take calves that were old enough to be sold at auction, to a livestock auction. So we did a lot of things of that sort just because. Did go to summer camp.
Was that a Girl Scout camp?
Not Girl Scout. I went to a YWCA camp north of Montgomery, and also went to a music camp at the University of Alabama.
Okay, and did you have friends that lived near you that became special to you and stay in touch with?
I still have contact with some of my high school friends. In fact, my best friend from high school, whom I roomed with at music camp, we studied piano from the same teacher. She and I are planning a trip to Scotland in the fall. She likes to travel, her husband not so much, and she was looking for somebody to travel with, and so we're going to be traveling together and rooming together after a number of years.
Again. Did your father take you and your family on vacations during the summer?
Yes.
And where
yes.
did you all go?
In the U.S., we went to a number of national parks. We went to New York City one summer. We went out west to Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, obviously the Smoky Mountains, and some of the other parks in the eastern United States.
Do you recall any of your favorite books from the time you were in junior high and high school? Any novels?
Oh, that's a hard one. I love to read. Of course, like most girls of that age, I read all the Nancy Drew books and similar types of things. But then, you know, a lot of the classic English novels, it'd be hard to pick a favorite.
Well, did you, during the summers, besides everything that you just mentioned, have any part-time work or volunteer work during the summer?
Generally not. In the town we lived in, summer jobs for teenagers were pretty hard to come by. I did, as I was probably early teenager and as a teenager, if my dad's secretary was on vacation, sometimes I would fill in at his medical office. But other than that, summer jobs were actually pretty unusual simply because they really weren't available. Kids did work if their family owned a business. They would frequently work in their family business in the summer, but there weren't McDonald's. I mean, we really didn't have fast food restaurants at that time.
How large was Clanton at
Oh,
that
it was
time?
about 5,000 people.
Very small.
Very small.
And
very
did you
small.
learn to drive a car in Clanton?
Oh, yes.
And did that give you some freedom about moving around and getting to other cities like Montgomery?
Yes. I mean, we didn't do... At that time, it was really a little bit unusual for a carload of kids to take off somewhere. We did a little bit. Actually, one of the favorite pastimes was Sunday afternoon driving around town. One of my friends' father was a rural mail carrier, and he used his own car as a mail carrier. And she could use it on weekends, but of course he had to keep very meticulous records of what his mileage was when he left on his last route on Saturday before he went again on Monday. And she told the story of once she got home from school on a Monday and she said, "Kathy, where did you all go? The number of miles you put on my car on Sunday is absurd." And she said, "We were just driving from North Clanton to South Clanton."
Well, as you get closer to the end of high school, you start thinking about going to college.
Right.
And what were the considerations that you had in selecting a college, and where did you go?
Well, okay. As far as college was concerned, my father was a believer in education. And that had been instilled in all of us from the time we were little kids, that college was something we would be doing. And that a lot of the, of our high school careers were really making sure that we had the courses that would be necessary for college admission. And my father's position on education was, and he was not someone who spent money just because, but there were things that he would spend money on, and he told all of us, my sister, my three brothers, and myself, that as long as we were seriously pursuing an education, he would pay for it. And he did. I looked at a number of colleges, of course some in the state of Alabama, but I also looked outside the state of Alabama. And I guess by the time I was finally making my college choices, and at that time you really didn't apply to 10 or 12 colleges the way kids do today, I think I ended up applying to 4 schools, the University of Alabama, Birmingham Southern College, which was a private liberal arts college in Birmingham, Vanderbilt, where my father had gone, as did his father and his uncle, and to Rice University in Houston, Texas. And when I narrowed down my choices, I had narrowed it down to Vanderbilt and Rice, and ended up opting to go to Rice.
What year did you graduate from
Graduated from high school in 1964.
So that September you started at Rice.
Yes.
And what was your major?
History.
And do you recall any professors that made a big impact on you?
Actually, yes, both in the history department and outside the history department. Actually, one of my favorite professors was a biology professor who was just an incredible teacher. Within the history department, I had two professors that made a real impression on me. One was a professor who taught American economic history, and the other one was a professor who taught modern American history. And my concentration was American history as opposed to European.
All right. So you study history as a major, and you have to be away from home for the very first time. You're living in a dorm. How did you set up study habits? What kind of study habits did you bring to the table?
Ooh, that's a long time ago. I think college is always an adjustment because you don't have somebody, telling you've got to get your homework done. But the college was fairly supportive in the sense in that a part of orientation was devoted to explaining that there would be a lot of demands scholastically, and that it was important to not put things off until the end of the semester. Many courses had a lot of reading. A few classes, although relatively few, took attendance. Most did not. Those that did, that was you were well aware of it. But many times the professors themselves provided some guidance about how to go about keeping up with the coursework. In that regard, I think the most interesting class was my course in American economic history, where the professor at first class.
What was his name?
His name was Louis Galambos. And Dr. Galambos, I believe, he left the university before I graduated, and I believe he went to Johns Hopkins. I actually came across his name several years ago as a byline on an article in the Wall Street Journal. But he was a very, very entertaining professor, but first class. He announced to the class that he said, I'm going to explain to you the expectations that I have in this class. And if you do not feel that you can meet these expectations, I would recommend that you drop the class now. And he said, there will be no exams in this class. He said, but each semester there will be 6 papers. And he said, they are on a very rigid time frame. And he said, you'll get a schedule of the topic for each and the due date. And he said, the papers are due by 5 o'clock on the Friday. It'll always be a Friday afternoon of the due date. And they must be in my office by 5 o'clock. If not, you're going to have an immediate deduction from your grade. He said, if the paper comes in, it comes under my door, he said, I'll leave at 5 and I'll have the papers that are turned in. If a paper is slipped under my door after 5, but before 9 the next morning, you will start out with an immediate 25-point deduction. He said, if the paper comes in after 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, you will start out with an immediate 50-point deduction. So people are kind of looking around the class. He said, so you're probably asking, If I can't get it in before 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, what's the point of writing it? And he said, the point of writing it is, if you don't turn in every paper, you're going to fail the class. So this was a pretty stringent, but you knew the rules ahead of time. And there were a few people who slipped, and they did pay the price. But knowing the rules ahead of time made it pretty easy.
Did you ever come close to a deadline?
Well, I usually got them in on the Friday afternoon, but I didn't come that close.
Okay.
I made every deadline.
You went to Rice, and my recollection is that it had primarily been an all-male school.
Not quite.
Okay.
It had never been all male. It had always been co-ed. However, the number of women students was relatively low. I believe we had 425 entering freshmen, and about 100 were women. About 4 times, 1 to 4. Also, I actually entered Rice the last year that it was tuition free. And the school had up until that year been tuition free. You of course had to pay room and board, and there were certain fees, but tuition, there wasn't any. The year after I entered, tuition was implemented, although it remained relatively low, but my class was the last class to complete Rice with no tuition.
And of those 400 students that you entered with, did you make some special friends in college?
Oh, yes, yes.
And do you keep in touch with them?
I do. There's a group of 4 of us who we haven't done it, and I guess our last time getting together was probably at our last college reunion, but we try to get together even between reunions. We started out with a larger group. Actually, 3 of the original group that started getting together are now deceased, which, you know, it's the reality of getting some distance between when we were in college and today. It still is a shock when I hear that an old friend has died, but it's the reality of getting older.
In the free time that you had at college, what were some of the extracurricular activities that you had?
Oh boy, let me think. I don't remember having a lot of free time. Well, being in a large city, particularly having grown up in a very small town, there were things to take advantage of in the city. Not that we did them every weekend. I mean, all of this stuff cost money, but there was actually a nice city park with a zoo relatively close to the campus. And a lot of us, you know, we had a nice afternoon. It was a great way to spend some time. Houston had a very good symphony. Occasionally we would do that. It had an excellent professional theater, the Alley Theater. Occasionally that would be something to do. And then there were events on campus. There were a lot of speakers, some kind of interesting, who came for some unusual reasons. I think probably the most memorable speaker on campus during my tenure there, I believe this was my junior year, was Ken Kesey, who was the subject of the Tom Wolfe novel, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Ken Kesey was a friend, a longtime friend, of the author Larry McMurtry, who at the time was a writing instructor at Rice. And Kesey had been convicted of some drug offense on the West Coast and was out on bail pending sentencing. And he and some of his merry pranksters, was the name of the group, took a bus trip across the U.S. and they came through Houston. And Larry McMurtry invited him to come to campus to read some of his work. And it was absolutely bizarre. But the group of us who were in the audience, who were closest to the door, when he announced, does anyone want to take a ride on the bus? Several of us jumped in line and got on the bus and rode around southwest Houston. There were no drugs involved in this. He was staying clean pending his sentencing. But it was an absolutely amazing and very memorable experience.
Well, that leads me to those times in the summer when you were not studying so hard. What did you do as far as summer work experience or summer adventures while you were in college?
Let me see. Summer after my sophomore year, I actually studied in Europe for 3 months.
Which country?
Primarily in Vienna, Austria. I spent 9 weeks in Vienna and then traveling the other 3 weeks, generally in Germany, a little bit in Switzerland.
Did you learn a foreign language?
I did. I had studied German, and the classes that I was taking in Vienna were actually in the German language. And unfortunately, I really can't speak it anymore. But at the end of the summer, I was conversational enough that I could easily get around speaking only German. Unfortunately, that skill is long gone.
And do you remember what you might have done the other summers?
What did I do? Summer after freshman year, I honestly don't remember what I did that summer. I do remember the summer after my junior year. My father had had surgery, and planned surgery. It was not nothing life-threatening, but it was fairly major surgery, and he could not drive for a while, and so I stayed home. He had the surgery in the summer. I stayed home so that I could drive him. I would go to his office with him, take him to the hospital when he had to make rounds at the hospital, and just generally be available for him as a resource. And, I managed to find something to do. It seems like one summer I may have taught swimming lessons at the local pool.
You were going to college during the mid-'60s.
Correct.
And into the late 60s, a time in which the Vietnam War was building up. Did you have any military service?
I did not.
Did you have any experiences as it related to what was happening in our nation during that time of social unrest and upheaval, both with civil rights and the Vietnam
Well,
War?
Of course, as a native of Alabama, the early 60s, well, actually even going back to the 50s, when the bus boycott occurred in Montgomery, I can't remember what year that was, but I do remember the most disappointing thing about the whole thing was there had been a little park in Montgomery, Lane Park, and it was not unusual for in elementary school to take a school trip, and we would go to Lane Park, which was just a nice little city park in Montgomery that had a small zoo. In the aftermath of the bus boycott and the beginning of the civil rights movement, the city of Montgomery closed the park. So it sort of left, a little bit of a bad taste in our mouths. But the early 60s, 62, 63, I do remember when the Freedom Riders came into the state. Of course, they bypassed our town. We were off the interstate, but on the drive from the north to Montgomery, and of course it was all over the news. And the demonstrations in Birmingham, particularly when Bull Connor had his fire hoses out, it was a time of a lot of turmoil and a lot of concern. I think anyone who grew up in the South recognizes that the South did not exactly willingly embrace the Civil Rights Movement or the Civil Rights Act after it was adopted by Congress. but I think many of us felt that it was a time of a lot of change that needed to happen. I think partly because my family was not completely homegrown Southerners, we maybe had a little bit of a different perspective than perhaps some of my friends whose families had been in the South for forever, but having 3 Yankee grandparents does put a little bit different spin on things, I think. It was a tough time. I mean, my high school was, of course, segregated. It did eventually integrate, but not while I was there.
When did you first become aware yourself of segregation and kind of the impact? Because as a young child, most individuals aren't that aware of the interactions of adults and others. You just see your little friends in play. So when did you become aware of segregation?
I think it was the Montgomery bus boycotts, and I believe that was in '56, I think. It was '56 or '57, and I was 9 or 10 years old. But I think that's when I first became aware of it. Of course, you couldn't escape the fact, growing up in the South, of the separate restrooms, the separate water fountains. I do remember, I cannot remember exactly how old I was. I was still relatively young. I was in Montgomery in a department store with my mother, and I think perhaps some of my brothers, maybe my sister. I don't know how many of us were with her. But it was the middle of the summer, and it was hot. And there was a long line at the water fountain, the white water fountain. And my mother just took us up to the other water fountain and said, "It's the same water, we'll just get our water here." I think that was a pretty radical thing to have done, in hindsight, I kind of appreciate the fact that she did, because I think it made an impression that there's something that's wrong with this picture.
And when you finished high school and you went to Rice, now it's 65, the Vietnam War is going on, we're still having some racial, well, a lot of racial discord.
A lot of racial discord in the South.
Did that play over into Rice and your education in college?
Actually, when I entered Rice, the undergraduate school was not integrated. The first African American students were admitted in 1965 in the class the year after I was. So it was, the process was evolving. But even there, we did not have a significant minority population in the school.
And do you recall any problems that they had acclimating to the university, or anybody saying anything about the fact that it was integrated?
I don't recall. I think it was something that most of us expected that it would happen, and thought it was the right thing. But it was a slow process. I mean, there were only a handful of African American students during the time I was there.
Now, I know that you are a well-read person. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal. I know you read a lot of publications and have in the past, and stay well informed. How early in your life did you begin to become aware of national events and start expanding your view beyond Clanton?
Very young. And again, I have to, that's something that I think is because of my parents, my father in particular, in that my father liked to keep up with national events. I think at that time I know we got the Sunday New York Times. Of course, it came several days after Sunday. It was not daily delivery. We did get the Sunday New York Times. We got news magazines. Of course, at that time, the evening news was 15 minutes. But when my dad got home from his office, it was normally in the 5:30 time frame, and he always wanted to watch the national news. So,
which channel did he watch? Which newscaster?
Well, there weren't a lot to choose from. I think there were 2 stations in Birmingham and 1 in Montgomery. And I think one was a CBS affiliate, the other was an NBC
Walter
affiliate.
Cronkite, did he have a favorite?
I don't remember that there was a favorite. I'm pretty sure that the Montgomery station was well, I don't know if it was an NBC affiliate or not. I don't remember but it was whatever the national news was. So I think, keeping up with what was going on nationally was something that started early for me.
Did you and your brothers and sister talk about it with your father and mother at the table, or was there a conversation?
Dinner was sort of a time. First of all, the television was off during dinner. There was no watching TV and eating dinner. It was sitting at the table. And typically, there would be a discussion of something that may have happened in the news, either at the state level or the national level. Mm-hmm. So that was actually a common dinner topic.
Well, you had the man on the moon. You had the Kennedy assassination. And then after that, you had Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Yep. Mm-hmm. All of those. I think that probably happened in college. But
it did.
But you would have been home for JFK.
The Kennedy assassination was in the fall of 1963, my senior year in high school. I remember it vividly, as I think everyone does who was old enough to realize what was happening.
What were you doing at the time?
I was in school. It was during the school day, and school was actually dismissed early. And I believe that we did not have school the next day. I cannot remember what day of the week it was.
It was November 22nd, close to Thanksgiving.
It was, yes. I think it was the week before Thanksgiving.
The week of Thanksgiving.
And was it the week of Thanksgiving? So I think school was dismissed early, and we did not have school the next day. And I think that was canceled because of the death of the president. And of course, that was on TV, and we watched it. Martin Luther King's assassination occurred when I was a senior in college, just before spring break. And of course, Robert Kennedy was that summer.
When the first man on the moon took his first step, was that when you were still in school at home?
No, that was, I believe, was that the summer of 68 or 9?
I think 8.
Okay.
Would have been in college.
Well, I graduated, but I was working that summer at a Girl Scout camp, and we actually, several of the counselors asked if we could arrange to have a television set brought into the dining hall so the campers could watch the transmissions of the first steps on the moon. And I think we were more fascinated by it than our young campers were. In fact, some of them kind of wondered why they were being hauled in to watch it. Maybe they appreciate it today, I don't know. But yeah, I was actually working as a counselor at a summer camp.
Well, we've mentioned briefly the Girl Scouts. At what age did you start, as a Brownie or as a Girl Scout?
I never was a Girl Scout.
You never
They
were?
did not have Girl Scouting in town when I was growing up.
Although your mother was a Girl Scout
Well,
leader?
my sister is 6.5 years younger than I. A family moved to town, and their daughter was a friend of my sister's in the same grade, and her mother had been a Girl Scout leader in whatever community they had come from before they moved to town. Her father had taken a job in town, and she began talking to some of the parents of other kids in their class about starting a Girl Scout troop. And so they did. And my mother did training, and she served as a Girl Scout leader for a number of years. After my sister actually stayed in scouting through high school. But sometime after, my mother kind of dropped out of scouting after my sister had graduated from high school, although she did go back a few years later when the daughter of a cousin of my dad's was in a troop, and they had lost their troop leader, and they were having trouble recruiting somebody, and my mother agreed to go back to be a scout leader for Rebecca's troop.
Well, you mentioned that you, after you graduated from college, worked in a Girl Scout camp.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you did immediately upon graduating. What
Yep.
were your plans after you graduated from college?
Well, I had applied to and was accepted in law school.
Now, why did you decide to go to law school?
Sometimes I ask myself that question. I'm not sure I can point to a single thing. There are probably a lot of things that played into it. One was I did want to have a career.
When did you first kind of sense that you wanted a career? You know, was it in high school? Was it
no.
in college?
When I was in grade school.
Grade school.
Yes.
What made you think you wanted a career when you were in grade school?
My father.
Okay.
My father strongly believed that, as I said, he was a believer in education, but he also believed that everyone should have the ability to support themselves. And he felt strongly about it. So I was getting a lot of encouragement, parental encouragement, to do something besides just go to college and then do whatever.
What careers did you consider?
Well, one time I actually considered medicine, but I did not follow through on that. I was not in a science curriculum, and I would had to have probably gone back and taken a number of prerequisites.
I think we should tell the truth about you and blood.
Oh yeah, I do not do well with blood. Although I can handle other people's blood better than my own.
I think I have heard a story or two where...
Yes, I have fainted. You're right about that, passed out cold. But that was my own blood.
Okay.
But
as you're thinking through careers, you thought about medicine.
Yeah.
Did you think of any other careers?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, particularly growing up when I did, teaching was always, you know, on any girl's list of possible careers. But I think...
Did you look at the one ads and see for men only and women only as far as careers?
You know, I don't know that I ever looked at ads. Maybe if I had, I would have been a little bit more worried. It just never really occurred to me that if I had the training to do something that I couldn't do it. So that just really didn't enter into the picture.
Did you know any lawyers growing up?
I actually did know lawyers growing up. My father had a very good friend who was a lawyer. My best friend's father was a lawyer. He was actually the district attorney in town. There were other people that were my parents' contemporaries who were lawyers, who were friends of my father's and my mother's. So it was not that I had no exposure. I don't know that I knew a lot about the profession, but
as you got close to graduating, you decided to apply to law school.
I did. And I think another factor in that, too, was Rice was a school that did focus on postgraduate education. Of course, typically in any university setting, your professors tend to think what they did, which was they went to graduate school and got a PhD. And some of my friends did that. But there was really a lot of emphasis on education beyond the four-year degree. Not that everyone did it. A number of students did not, but a number did. And so it was a part of just kind of the atmosphere.
Did you talk to a guidance counselor? How did you determine like what law schools to look at, where you might go? Did you do it all on your own?
I did it pretty much on my own. I mean, I mean, obviously, you know, you would talk with other students because I knew other students who were considering going to law school, and
did they?
Some did. Some did. So, you know, we talked about potential law schools. I took the LSAT in the fall of my senior year and was starting to look. And even though we really didn't have a lot of very specific guidance, there were resources. And I remember one morning I got a phone call from the Office of the Dean of Undergraduate Affairs saying that a recruiter from the University of Chicago was going to be on campus and was wanting to talk to any women who had expressed an interest in law school. And they knew who had taken the LSAT. There weren't many of us, but and said, would I like to come over? And I thought, why not? You know.
How many do you think took the LSAT women in your class?
Boy, I am trying to remember how many actually took it that year. There were some who went to law school later, but I would say there were probably 4 or 5 of us who took the LSAT.
Very low number.
Very low number. Very low number.
But you went to the Chicago interview?
I did go to the Chicago interview, and I had not. University of Chicago was not on my list, and it turned out it was actually a student interviewer who had graduated from Rice a few years before. And they would send students back to their undergraduate schools to interview. And he really encouraged me to apply to Chicago. I ended up not doing it. I've kind of wished I had, in a way, just more out of curiosity. But he asked me, he said, have you ever considered University of Chicago? And I said, well, not really. And he said, any particular reason not? And I said, well, I mean, I don't know a lot about the University of Chicago other than I understand it is in a pretty rough part of Chicago. And he said, oh, it's not that bad. I said, you mean it's not that rough? He said, oh, no, it's in a terrible area. It's just living in it is not that bad. And I thought, I don't know that my parents are going to be ecstatic about that concept. And actually, I mean, that's the sad thing. It's a wonderful law school. But at that time, it really was in a pretty difficult area. Some years after that, I talked to someone who had finished at law school. Some years, it would have been several years after I would have finished, and I asked him, I said, how was the area? He said, well, it was improving a little bit, but he said, I got mugged on campus. So I thought, maybe this was just as well. But I did focus on schools more in the South and Southwest.
Which schools were on your list?
University of Texas, Vanderbilt, University of Virginia, University of Alabama. Seems like there was a 5th, but I can't remember what it was.
Did any of the recruiters from those schools come to Rice?
They did not actually come to Rice. Although after I was accepted, I got contacted by University of Texas Law School, and they were trying to increase the number of women students. And I had narrowed it down to Texas. I think I was waitlisted at Virginia. I was accepted at University of Alabama. I was accepted at Texas, and I was accepted at Vanderbilt. And I had narrowed it down to University of Texas or Vanderbilt. And
Had you been to either one of those?
Huh?
Had you visited either of those schools before you applied?
I had visited the campuses, but I had not specifically visited the law schools, which was probably a mistake. But I ended up opting for Vanderbilt for a couple of reasons. One, frankly, my father, family members had gone there. The other was it was a smaller school than University of Texas. University of Texas was a large law school. The entering class at University of Texas would have been about the size of my entering class at Rice. It was a large law school. And it was a tough decision because both had some appeal, but I finally opted for the smaller setting. And that's how I ended up there.
And once you decided to go to Vanderbilt Law School, what did you discover when you got there?
Well, I discovered that I was one of 4 entering women students in
Out
a
of
class
how many?
of a class of 100, somewhat over 100. I don't remember exactly, but a very, very small number.
How many women in the whole law school at the time?
I want to say that there were 2 in the class the year ahead of me, and maybe 3 in the 3rd year class. It was a very small number.
Were there any women law professors?
No. It was a bigger shock than I was anticipating.
Tell me about that first year in law school, the type of classes that you took, what was the manner of teaching, who were your favorite professors?
Okay, well, of course, I think it was a very standard first-year curriculum. I think we had criminal law, torts, contracts, real property, civil procedure,
Criminal law.
something else.
Criminal law.
I think I said criminal. Seems like, constitutional law. I think constitutional law was 1 semester, and maybe real property was only 1 semester, but criminal law, I believe, was 2 semesters, torts was 2 semesters, contracts was 2 semesters. When did we have, I don't remember if Uniform Commercial Code was first year or second, anyway, but it was a very standard, I think we had legal writing 1 semester. I think constitutional law was only 1 semester, but it was the basic same course. You had a little more choice second year, but I think the professors that I remember that I thought were the best, I thought John Wade in torts was very, very good, excellent professor. Carl Warden in criminal law was creative, was a good professor. I don't know that I thought any of the other professors were quite at that caliber. There were good professors. I unfortunately did not have Paul Hartman for contracts. I did take other courses from him, and I thought he was one of the best professors in the law school. We almost got the sense, all of the women students were put in a different contracts class. And some people opined that they thought that Hartman was maybe a little bit too much for women students, which was utterly absurd. It was, when I did have him, I thought he was a fabulous professor.
During that first year, did you find that the workload was any heavier than that you had at Rice as an undergraduate?
No, it was no heavier. It was different. The method, of course, was, you knew what you needed to review, and then you had to be prepared to recite a case in class.
I don't think they do this now, but what was the method that they used at that time?
Oh, it was the case method. You would, if you got called on, you would be asked to talk about the whatever case and answer questions about it. And
stand and recite.
Stand and recite. Stand and recite. Not sure that it's necessarily a very effective teaching method, but it was the way it was done. I'm hoping that they have a little more innovation in teaching in law school now.
It's a rather intense experience. Did you form any long-lasting friendships in law school?
You know, there are a lot of people that I have, you know, I still see occasionally, hear from. Probably not as strong as friendships as I had in college. And again, I think part of it is, I mean, my closest friendships, of course, were with women students. And there were so few of us that it was, you just didn't have as much to choose from. I mean, of course, you have been, since you entered 2 years later, we have been friends since then.
Correct.
But in my own class, I was actually one student dropped back to part-time. I believe she eventually went back and finished, but I lost touch with her.
What's her name?
Her name was Sandra Jackson.
I do remember her.
And then Jane Evans was in my class, and periodically over the years I might have some contact with Jane.
Rita Greer was a year ahead of you?
Rita Sanders was a year ahead of me.
Okay. And were you in the class with Carl Warden when he
did the murder?
Did the murder?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Well, tell me about the murder in the law school.
Oh, that was great. It's one of those really memorable experiences, and actually a little bit of an aside. A couple of my classmates that I see at reunions and things like that, a few years ago, one of them sent an email to everyone that in our class whose email address was on Vanderbilt's website. You could arrange to have the email sent. They wouldn't give you the email, and then you could respond. And he was trying to put together a little mini reunion. And I ended up responding that I would love to go. So we ended up there. Ended up just being a handful of us who went. I don't know, 8 or 10. It was not a large crowd, but it was in Scottsdale, Arizona. And as it turned out, the murderer was at our reunion. Or wait, was he the murderer?
Or the victim.
Or was he I think he was the person who was accused, if I remember correctly. And we got to talking about it one night, and it was absolutely hysterical. But he gave us kind of the insight about how the whole thing was put together.
Well, set it up and tell me what happened.
Well, I'll tell you what we learned. It was the murder happened, or the alleged murder happened, between the 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock class on one morning, so that all of the first-year students would be in the building, because if you didn't have the 8 o'clock class, you had a 9. And it happened in the student lounge. And actually, no, the guy who was at our reunion was the person who allegedly got stabbed. The murderee, the victim. The setup had been going on for a couple of weeks. And one of the female students was involved in it. Actually, the rest of us thought this was a little bit odd because we knew she had a boyfriend and she was hanging around with a guy in our class. We didn't want to say anything to her because, well, maybe they broke up or whatever. And
was she another law student?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And anyhow, the guy's wife was in on it too. She had to be in on it.
Oh,
because
this man was married?
Wait. He was the alleged killer, because she was setting up his wife, and she was great. She told about her role in it, that she was setting up ahead of time by calling his friends and saying, Jerry's been acting a little bit strange lately. I don't know quite what to make of it. And
this is the wife?
The wife, yeah. And she was calling his friends and saying he's just acting a little bit odd. And I don't know whether the law school is getting to him or something like that. But anyhow, they staged a stabbing. in the student lounge. And it was over the girl, because whoever got stabbed was hanging out with her. Anyway, it wasn't evident initially. I did not actually witness it. I came in just as it was just going nuts. I mean, people were just going crazy. And but there were a number of Vietnam vets in our class. We actually had an average older class age than either of the two classes before us, because there was no longer any deferment for law school, and they accepted a larger number of students who already had their military service. So we had a pretty good number of guys who had actually been in the service and had been in combat. Well, anyhow, when it happened, several of them just, oh my God, and they started chasing him. And somebody called an ambulance, and it was just a complete free-for-all. And I don't think that Professor Warden ever intended that it be viewed. I mean, he thought people would get it right away, that it was all an act. But initially they didn't. And the ambulance came to the law school. People were chasing the alleged murderer. It was a stabbing, and I mean, they had fake blood and everything, and it looked pretty real.
Were you there when the victim got up and wasn't injured?
Well, we realized he wasn't injured pretty quickly, but then we got called into one of the classrooms where Warden started using it as a teaching experience and asking people what they saw. And it was an incredible education in how people think they've seen something that maybe they didn't see. But at this little mini reunion, we got to talking about it, and hearing it firsthand from some of the participants was a riot. And actually, one of the other students who was there had been a good friend of the guys, and he was saying, yeah, he said, when Diane started calling us and saying, he's acting funny, I don't know what's going on, he said, we didn't know quite what to do. I mean, but the setup had been going on for a while. It was very, very clever.
So did Warden get into any trouble because of this?
Oh, nothing horrible. I think somebody had to pay for the ambulance, but...
Well, I don't think there's any other event in law school that matches quite the murder.
No.
Or almost the murder.
Yeah.
But did you have any activities related to the law school or outside of the law school during the 3 years that you were there? Did you work outside of the law school?
I did not work outside of the law school.
And what did you do during the summers?
Well, getting a job was not all that easy for a female law student. I think one summer I actually went back and worked at the camp again because I couldn't get a job. I think what I found about law school was it was a far more difficult environment for women at that time than I had ever imagined it would be. I had been at a college where women were a minority of the students, but I never felt like my being there was being questioned. But in law school, and it was by no means universal, but I did get the feeling that there were people in the law school administrations who would have been just as happy if we had not been there.
Were there any African Americans?
One in my class. Of course, Rita Sanders in the class 1 year ahead of me, and I don't remember anyone in the third year class. There were 2 African American students in the class the year ahead of me. Russell Enix was in that class, but I don't believe anyone was in the third year class. I am not.
So maybe 3 in the whole law school?
Huh?
Maybe 3 African Americans?
Yeah. I mean, it was a fewer number than female students. And, of course, in the case of Rita, it was the old killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You get to tick off your African American and your woman with 1 person.
Right.
I know that's kind of a jaded way to look at it, but you wondered a little bit.
As you came to the end of law school. Again, it's the next step. What were the considerations that you had as far as how to use your law degree?
Oh, well, I, of course, had assumed that I would be able to practice law and that it would not be that difficult to get a job. That was a very rude awakening. The interview process was demeaning.
Tell me a little bit about the interview process, because I'm familiar with it, but I don't think for your audience they are aware.
There were a lot of on-campus interviews with law firms and sometimes other entities, but primarily law firms.
From all over
They were primarily southeast, but some were a little bit more broadly based. You would sign up to interview with the recruiter from that particular law firm. And I don't know how many I went to, but in more than one interview, I was basically told I was wasting my time. They did not hire women. They did not intend to hire women. And they frankly did not think that women could function in a law firm. It was a very demeaning experience. It was very upsetting. And
rather demoralizing.
It was very demoralizing. And I really began to wonder if I had wasted 3 years of my life and my father's money going to law school. The one interview, actually, I did have one interview that did lead me eventually to a job offer, which for a variety of reasons, it wasn't practical for me to take that offer, although it was months later. I had just about had it up to here with what I was being told in these interviews. And
let me ask, just at this moment, how did you do scholastically in law school?
You know, I wasn't at the top of the class, but I did fine. I mean, frankly, I think that law school rankings are sort of absurd, particularly when you look at the assigning numerical grades and then averaging it to the 10,000th decimal place. The number is not significant, and so few numbers separated the top quarter from the bottom quarter. I mean, it was pretty absurd. I mean, everybody was pretty much bunched together.
Right.
You had outliers on both ends, but everybody was pretty much together. But I certainly did adequately in law school. I guess I just had it. And the interviewer was actually not quite as bad as some I had had. But I thought, you know, I'm wasting my time being here. And I think I actually said to the interviewer, I said, you know, I've been through a number of these interviews, and we'd gotten far enough into it that I knew I was not going to be considered for a job. It was a Birmingham, Alabama firm, because I did think, well, I'm a native of Alabama, maybe that counts for something. I finally just said to him, I said, you know, I feel like I'm wasting my time being here. It looks like law firms are just not interested in hiring women. And, I kind of mouthed off, which probably was not the smartest thing to do, but since I didn't think I was going to get a job out of it anyway, it didn't make any difference. Interestingly, a few weeks after the interview, I got a letter from the partner who had interviewed me. And what he basically said was, he said, you know, as we discussed, I'm not in a position to be offering you a job, but I have taken the liberty of giving your name to the United States Attorney in Birmingham. I don't know what his hiring plans are, but I feel like you know, that might be something that you would be interested in. So I thought, well, you know, maybe it wasn't a complete waste. But I didn't hear anything. And by now I had already opted to take the Tennessee bar. I was debating, should I take the Alabama bar, should I take the Tennessee bar? And I thought, well, Tennessee at least has reciprocity with Kentucky. Alabama had reciprocity with nobody. So I thought maybe it's a better way to go. So I had opted to take the Tennessee bar. And up in the summer, I got a call from the U.S. Attorney in Birmingham saying I am probably going to be having an opening, and I had gotten your name from whoever this lawyer was, whose name I do not remember right now, or if I ever would. And I explained to him, I said, here's my problem is I've kind of past the point of no return on bar exam. And I'm taking the Tennessee bar and not the Alabama bar, and I know that I'd have to have the Alabama bar. And what he said was actually somewhat encouraging. He said, look, I understand your situation. He said, obviously you're looking for a job there, but he said, if nothing turns up and you have any interest in it, get back in touch with me. You know, he said you would have to take the bar, and of course it won't be offered again until the spring. But, I want to at least tell you that the door is open. So I thought, well, that's, it's not there, but at least there's maybe hope. And so, I took the Tennessee bar. I passed. I still didn't have a job. And I'm, really wrestling with what to do. I think I had applied at several state agencies. So far, nothing. I don't remember what else I was looking at. And then, probably towards the end of the year, early the next year, I made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Nashville. I was incidentally the only woman admitted to practice in Davidson County in 1971. Not the only admitted in the state, but the only person admitted in Davidson County, only woman admitted in Davidson County. Anyway, I'd made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Nashville.
Were you doing any legal work during this time?
I was doing a little bit of, a couple of friends were letting me handle a few matters, general sessions, but it was nothing that was going to lead to anything. And so I really was feeling the pressure of having to get a job.
Did they have any legal clinics that actually gave you in-court experience?
Not really, not really.
And Ted
Walker.
Walker.
I did a little work with him, and then I think I got on the federal appointed panel for U.S. District Court.
Okay.
And I had, basically walking somebody through a guilty plea, but it was something. And it seems like there was something else that I got on a, possibility of doing something, but I knew I couldn't make a living doing this. But I had applied at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Did you apply with the DA?
I did not apply with the DA, and I really don't know why I didn't, but I did with the State Attorney General, nothing. I think I applied with one or two state agencies, nothing.
Did they have any women attorneys at the time?
To be honest, I don't know. The State Attorney General's office was pretty small at that time.
Like 8 or 9.
I do not recall any women. I had applied, I think I applied for a judicial clerkship. But anyhow, I had applied at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Of course, told there's no opening right now, but very shortly after the first of the year, perhaps before the end of the year in 1971, I got a call from the U.S. Attorney in Nashville. And I'll be honest, at this time, I was thinking about maybe I better get back in touch with that guy in Birmingham and think about taking the Alabama bar. But I got a call from Charlie Anderson, the U.S. Attorney in Nashville, saying that he had an opening and would I be interested in coming in and interviewing. And it was like, yes, yes, yes. So I did, and I got a job. And interestingly, it was, I had, of course, to have a background, the background investigation, and until that was completed, and all the paperwork was completed. The process actually took a couple of months. I want to say it was in February of '72. The background was finished. They had the authorization, but there was a bit of a problem, just paperwork problem. My appointment had to be signed by the Attorney General, or in this case, the acting Attorney General, who was Richard Kleindienst. John Mitchell had left as U.S. Attorney General to run Nixon's '72 election campaign. And Kleindienst was acting Attorney General pending, he had been appointed, he had been named to be the replacement Attorney General, but his appointment had gotten snarled up over the ITT investigation, and he was spending all of his time testifying and was not signing any of the Assistant U.S. Attorney appointments. So I just had to hang tight until it got signed. And one day I got a call and said, it's been signed, so I had a job.
What was your first salary?
Huh?
What was your salary?
My salary was $12,000 a year, and I was thrilled.
And what were some of your first cases that you took as an assistant U.S. attorney?
I basically picked up the caseload that Ames Davis had. Ames had been in the office, and he had left to, I think he had been at Waller before he went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he was returning to private practice. And he had predominantly the civil caseload. So I picked up Ames's caseload, as well as new things, but my caseload was intentionally primarily civil. I think there was a perception that maybe a woman shouldn't be trying criminal cases, although I did try criminal cases. I just did not have as heavy a criminal caseload as the men in the office did. But I picked up a number of active cases, including having to write a Sixth Circuit brief in a case that was on appeal. So I had to, of course, study the record. In those days, we were actually handling a lot of cases involving urban renewal. There were several large urban renewal cases filed at various times challenging elements of urban renewal projects. The reason that the federal government was a defendant was it was normally the Department of Housing and Urban Development that was the federal funding agency. The operative agency was the Nashville Housing Authority. I think it's now MDHA. So we were the funder, but we were an essential party. One of the cases involved the urban renewal project called the University Center Urban Renewal Project, which was around Vanderbilt. We had the Downtown Urban Renewal Project, which, if you had been in Nashville at that time, you would have known that Detteridge Street was Pawn Shop Road. It was a pretty shabby street, but this particular urban renewal project is what resulted in today's Detteridge Street, the location of the Tennessee Performing Arts Center, and just completely changed the shape of downtown.
Now the university urban renewal had to do with Vanderbilt, and it was a little bit of private eminent domain.
Oh yes, it was very controversial, but these cases were extremely interesting, even though the federal defendant was in many respects a nominal defendant because it was simply a funding issue, but you had to be there. And it was important to understand the issues. And I had the opportunity to work with some excellent lawyers. Joe Lackey represented the Housing Authority at that time, and of course he had done a lot of that work. With Vanderbilt, I was working with Woody Sims and John Bailey on that case. So I had the opportunity to work with some really, really fine Nashville lawyers. which in and of itself was just an educational experience. It was terrific training.
Well, as you finished law school, you have this experience of getting a job. You're now in the first job. How did you reflect on your career choice at that time?
You know, it was not what I thought I would be doing. But in looking back at it, it is probably the best thing that ever happened to me. And let me say candidly, I was hired in the U.S. Attorney's Office because of affirmative action. It was the beginning of an election year. The Justice Department decided that they needed to have better representation from women and minorities. Under those circumstances, it didn't hurt to be one of the few available.
How many assistant U.S. attorneys were there in Nashville?
There were,
in the Middle District.
I'm trying to remember if there were 6 when I entered the office. We did increase by a couple, but the other assistants at the time I entered the office were Joe Brown, Fred Thompson, Ray Whitley, Ira Parker.
He was African American. No?
No, none. Although Irvin Kilcrease was hired about 3 months after I was. I think it was just Joe, Fred, Ira, Ray Whitley, and me. Then Irvin came in to replace Fred Thompson when Fred left to work in Howard Baker's campaign. And then over the next couple of years, there were a couple of additional positions added in the office.
Any of them women?
Not while I was there.
Oh. Okay. All right. With regards to the individuals that were in the U.S. Attorney's Office, how long did most people stay and how long did you stay?
At that time, most did not make a career. In fact, Joe of the group that was there when I was the only person who stayed in the office longer. There was sort of a presumption that that you would do it for a few years to get the experience. Although, let me go back a bit. At one time, there was an expectation that when the U.S. Attorney left because of a change in the political party, the U.S. Attorney is a political appointment, appointed, the office had been viewed as, well, the assistants kind of are hangers-on. Charlie, actually, while I think that some of the early hires might have had, a bit of political encouragement. I mean, Fred Thompson was close to Howard Baker and had worked in, I think, a congressional campaign he was from Lawrence County, which incidentally is where my mother grew up. And at one time, my aunt and uncle lived next door to Fred and his family. I did not know it. We probably knew each other as children, but I have no recollection of that. And there were a couple of others who might have had some political ties, but Charlie actually did not make that a criteria, certainly by the time he hired me. And as things happened over the years, the assistants' jobs became less identified as tied to the U.S. Attorney. And in fact, now there are many career people in U.S. Attorneys' offices. And I have kind of mixed feelings about it. It's a wonderful training ground for a young lawyer. I mean, sometimes I do think about the fact that we're representing the United States government with about zero experience, and is the government getting their money's worth? But we were eager to learn, and there was a lot to learn. On the other hand, I think there is some value in some career service. It's certainly becoming more common.
At that time, there were 2 federal judges?
Yes.
And they were?
Frank Gray and Judge L. Clore Morton. And I have to say that both of them were very supportive of me. I never felt that either judge thought any less of me because I was a woman. I will not say the same of some other lawyers in town, but the two federal judges were absolutely wonderful to me.
How long were you at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
I was there from 72. I left in the summer of 77, so somewhat over 5 years.
Do you have one or two cases that were memorable for you while you were there?
Oh, probably the most memorable case was one that I actually tried with Bill Farmer and Irvin Kilcrease, and it was a drug case against a physician, Dr. Snap. This was back in the days when the newspapers had reporters at the courthouse, and this case got a lot of coverage, and it was actually the first conviction of a doctor in the Middle District of Tennessee under the Drug Act that had been passed in the early 70s. I don't remember the year of it. But it was one of the most interesting cases I was ever involved in. It was quite a case.
What was he convicted of?
He was convicted of prescribing. Actually, it was really a diet pill, but it was an amphetamine type of drug. I think our pharmacologist who testified for the government said it's technically not called an amphetamine, but it's a first cousin. It's an upper. And he had been known as a pill peddler for a long time, and his practice was virtually nothing but prescriptions.
And during the time that you were in law school and at the U.S. Attorney's Office, had you developed any type of interest in politics?
You know, my interest in politics was really as an observer. I never had any interest in being involved in politics. And of course, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you obviously could, you know, your political views were your own, but you didn't broadcast them, and you didn't want to be overtly political. And you were expected not to be in the office. I mean, even though the U.S. Attorney was a political appointment, your obligation was not to politics or to any political doctrine. It was to the law. Right. And then after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I went into corporate in-house practice. And there, corporations don't like employees to be terribly vocal. I mean, it's not that you can't be, but it's generally you're better off just kind of not being overtly political.
Now, you started at $12,000. When you left 5+ years later, what was your salary?
Oh my gosh, Carol, I don't remember. I mean, I did get regular raises. I don't remember what it was.
Do you think you were making over $20,000?
Probably. I'm trying to remember when I left and went into a corporate practice. I did not take a pay cut, but I can't remember what I was making in that job either.
Okay. Well, let me ask, what were your work hours like when you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Depended. If you had a case that you were working on, you could put in long hours. If you didn't, you know, if you weren't in court, I mean, U.S. Attorney's Office is, you try cases. I mean, you also write briefs and you have to respond, particularly in civil cases, to procedure, and you may be taking depositions. But your mission in life is to try cases.
How many jury trials do you think you tried during that time?
I don't know. There were not many civil jury trials. Normally the government, I think I had one civil case that had a jury. The government was the plaintiff and the defendant demanded a jury. Right. So most civil cases were not, but I did try several criminal cases, and those were usually jury trials. I think I had a couple of criminal cases where a jury was waived, But for the most part, those were jury trials.
And if you weren't in the middle of trying a case, were the standard hours 8 to 5, 8 to 4?
8 to 5, 5:30. If something happened late in the day, it might cause you to have to stay. For example, you might have an investigative agent who came in and needed a search warrant that you would have to authorize. So, you could have things that would cause you to stay over, but really the late hours were if you had a case that was in trial.
Did you have to record your time?
No.
Okay, so you didn't have to keep track of your time. Did you have to travel at all in that job?
Not a lot. We did, of course, argue cases in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, so that would involve going to Cincinnati. Occasionally, you would have cases in either the Columbia Division or the Northeastern Division, which was Cookeville. I actually tried a lot of land condemnation cases in Cookeville. Those were tried before a commission, not before a judge. And actually, I do remember one civil case that was probably the most memorable civil case I was ever involved in. And that was the case that arose out of a private plane hijacking that occurred in Nashville in the fall of 1971, ended tragically in Jacksonville, Florida, with the pilot killed, the hijacker killed his estranged wife, whom he abducted to take on this plane, and then killed himself. A civil lawsuit came out of that under the Federal Tort Claims Act, and it was actually tried by a senior Justice Department trial attorney, but I was assigned as the Assistant U.S. Attorney to handle the paperwork that had to be done in Nashville. But as a result of being assigned to the case, I participated in all of the discovery. I sat in. There were a number of in-camera conferences because it involved information at the time was classified regarding FBI procedures. And I sat in those testimony that took place in chambers instead of open court, and was considered a part of the defense team. And it was a fascinating case.
Now we have 5.5 years in, you're making that transition. Did you start looking for another job opportunity, or did someone come to you?
Someone came to me. I found looking for a job to be such a miserable experience in law school that I just didn't want to do it. And in all honesty, we knew that the U.S. Attorney would leave. Didn't really know the implications for the assistants, but I got contacted by the General Counsel of NLT Corporation, whom I had met in connection with a tax refund suit, which again, I did not actually handle the case. That was handled by the Justice Department's tax division, but I handled the paperwork. And one thing led to another. He asked me if I might be interested in...
And who was this?
It was Rob Ledyard. Okay. And asked me if I might be interested in joining a corporate legal department, and I thought, might as well talk to him.
Was he general counsel?
He was general counsel, yes. So I ended up taking a position with NLT. Very, very different environment from the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Where were the offices?
They were in the National Life building, which is now a state office building.
But it was rather new then.
It was rather new, fairly new
plush.
Then. Well, it was nice. I don't know that I would call it plush. It was pretty modern, actually, on the interior. We were on the 25th floor, so we had a wonderful view of all over Nashville. But it was a very different environment. But there were things I missed about the pace of the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was a much faster paced environment. And you never knew what was going to happen. You just never knew from day to day what might walk in the door. Somebody could file a civil lawsuit and be seeking a temporary restraining order, and you had to be in court. Or a criminal case, you know, if an agent came in and wanted, you know, had an arrest warrant for somebody, you know, you maybe had to appear in the magistrate's office on bond and that sort of thing. So the corporate environment at NLT was a much more predictable environment, but it was not as fast-paced.
And no criminal activity.
Oh, no. I mean, it's not to say a corporation couldn't have criminal involvement, but it was not anything you wanted, and no, we did not have that.
And what areas did you tend to be assigned or tend to gravitate towards at NLT?
Actually, I started working with tax, and then that kind of led me into working with employee benefits. And ERISA, the Employment Retirement Security Act, was relatively new at the time, and I began working initially with the life insurance company, which was one of the subsidiaries of NLT, sold some tax-deferred IRAs and at that time, KEO plans. And there were compliance issues related to those plans, and I started working with those and then with the company's benefit plans. And so in addition to sort of just the corporate tax environment, I did work with tax-deferred vehicles, including employee benefits.
Did you begin to participate in more professional activities during that time, or?
Not a lot. I mean, I was a member of the Nashville Bar Association. I became a member of the corporate, actually, I don't believe the American Corporate Counsel Association developed a chapter here until later. But I think I did participate in Nashville Bar activities. I did that in the U.S. Attorney's Office. We had the Federal Bar Association, and I participated in that. Nashville Bar, of course, I can't remember when mandatory CLE started, but, you know, bar associations were a very good vehicle for continuing legal education programs. And then actually I did normally go to CLE type programs that were specifically related to what I was doing at NLT.
Now, after you finished law school, you're at the U.S. Attorney's Office and then at NLT. What is happening in your personal life? At what time did you get married?
I got married in 1975.
Just about the time that you were going to, well,
yeah, a year and a half before I ended up leaving.
And who did you marry?
I was married to Nevin Trammel.
And did you have any children?
We did. We had a daughter who was born while I was at NLT in 1980. And the relative predictability of the corporate world was actually, that was kind of an ideal setting because it was a much more predictable type of schedule. There were not a lot, there were occasionally circumstances at which you might have long hours, but the workday tended to be very, very regular.
Now, knowing you as a mother and also as a friend, Catherine is now married.
Yes.
And you're waiting on grandchildren.
Yes, but so far none.
Well, we'll continue to wait on that.
Yeah,
do you think there's a reason why Catherine did not become a lawyer?
Her interests were always, she's actually was a pretty talented artist, and her interests just were never in law. Mm-hmm. I think she found, she found what I was doing sort of interesting, but nothing that she wanted to do.
Did any of your other brothers or sister become a lawyer?
My sister has a law degree, although she has not practiced in a number of years. She took a position, a corporate position, right out of law school with, at that time, Pacific Bell, which was one of the baby bells. She actually was in
California?
In California, in San Francisco. Her husband is a lawyer also. And she actually was involved in some of the activities related to the spinoff of the so-called baby bells after the antitrust case. She worked at Pacific Bell, later Pacific Telesis. I think it's now been absorbed by some other, I think it's now was actually absorbed by the entity that ultimately became today's AT&T, which is not the old AT&T. She left practicing law and left her position after her third child was born. By that time, her husband had become a partner in a large San Francisco law firm, and it was just more practical for her to.
And what do your brothers do?
My oldest brother,
Who is named?
Peter, he has a PhD in mathematics, but he also has an accounting degree, and he works for the Department of Energy in Oak Ridge. My second brother also has a PhD in mathematics.
And
his name is David.
David Johnson? David Johnson.
David Johnson, and he's actually, he is retired and has been more or less retired for several years. He taught for a while. He actually taught at the University of Hawaii, taught mathematics, and then he later took a position with an organization that their primary client was the U.S. Navy. They hired mathematicians and other people with advanced degrees, and basically what he did was weapons analysis. He spent time, he traveled a lot. He lived in Italy for a while when he was based with the Mediterranean fleet. He actually lived on aircraft carriers for a couple of years in the Mediterranean. He was off the shore of Beirut when Beirut was being shelled.
And where is he now?
He lives in San Diego, California.
And your third brother?
My third brother went to medical school. He became a pathologist, and he's actually now retired.
And in Texas?
He lives in Texas.
Okay. As you were working at NLT, you were concentrating in the retirement plans, employment. Did you become active in any of the bar associations?
Well, not particularly, not after my daughter was born. I mean, working in, I do think it's one of the challenges that all women, in whatever career they have, face, is, like it or not, there are certain aspects of having children that fall more heavily on the woman. And so I really devoted a lot of time after Catherine was born to work and my child.
Now, we talked about trying to get a job right out of law school. Now you're at NLT. Were there any other women lawyers when you came to NLT?
No.
And how big of a legal department did they have?
Size, I want to say there were probably 18 or 20 lawyers. There were several different divisions. There was a real estate division. There was a group that handled insurance. There was a group that basically handled everything related to Opryland, WSM radio, WSM TV. Then there were the ones of us who worked in tax. I actually worked with Milton Rice, who did state taxes. And Milton had had a career largely in government prior to going to NLT, an absolutely wonderful person.
He had been the Attorney General?
He had been the Attorney General, I think actually maybe on an interim basis. I think the Attorney General had left, and then he was the Chief Deputy, I believe, and became Attorney General for a few months before a new Attorney General was named. He had been Commissioner of Insurance, and he was just a wonderful person.
Somewhat of a mentor, would you say?
He was a mentor in some respects.
And how did you find the reception of the other lawyers to you being included in the legal family?
Actually, I think both in the U.S. Attorney's Office and at NLT, I think a part of it is you got to get to know people. And once you develop a personal relationship, a lot of preconceived ideas fall away. I really had good relationships with my coworkers, and I never felt like there was resentment towards me being in the office.
How long were you at NLT?
I stayed at NLT until the summer of 1983. In the fall of 1982, NLT was acquired by American General Corporation out of Houston. And it was, any time you go through that type of an event in any environment, but it happens in the corporate environment. I mean, acquisitions occur. You know there's going to be change. And you have to accept that those things can happen. And of course, once it happened, we were all, what's going to happen to our jobs? For some people, I think the handwriting was on the wall sooner than for others, because American General had no interest in the non-life insurance businesses. And they very quickly wanted to sell off WSM, the Opryland, the Opryland Hotel, all of that. And so, although most of the lawyers in that group were able to go with the entity that acquired it because they wanted a Nashville presence, the insurance group, because certain insurance operations were going to remain in Nashville, were probably pretty safe. But the work I did was going to be handled at a headquarters. So I knew that my job was probably not here for the long term. Okay.
Martha, we were talking about the change that occurred with American General.
Right.
And some people coming, some people moving on with Gaylord when they took over Opryland, I guess. What was the impact on you?
Well, I knew that the work I was doing would not continue to be done in Nashville. It's headquarters work. There were some attorneys in the department, actually I think only one, who ended up going to Houston. Because of my husband's work, I really was not...
What did he do?
At that time, he was, let me see, what was he doing at that time? I believe he was with the state, I believe that was when he was with the State Parole Board. It was just not realistic for him to just pick up and move. And I had reservations about picking up and moving, even though I was familiar with Houston. It was not an unknown city to me. I would have probably had some reservations about that. But because of the employee benefit plans and the work I had done on those, I was involved in some of the transition activities. And I knew that there was a severance plan. Talk about looking at the practical side of things. I thought, okay, surely if my job gets eliminated, within the period of time, I forget how much severance, it translated into a number of months. I said, surely in that period of time, I have enough of a track record in Nashville that I can find a job. So I really didn't worry too much about it. And I thought, okay, what's the worst thing that happens? My job gets eliminated. I get a bridge. I have a few months paid vacation. So what's not to like about that? Well, in the theory that I could get a job. So I really did not get too hung up about the fact of the merger. And I actually thought there was a learning experience involved. I mean, I did, American General was into acquiring companies. And so they kind of had a cookbook of, what you did. And they always merged employee benefit plans. So I had the opportunity to actually learn something in the process. although the atmosphere at the company, of course, changed, and there were people who had varying degrees of discomfort with the uncertainty of the situation. So I really didn't start looking for a job. I was sitting at my desk one day, and I got a call from a couple of lawyers that I knew in Nashville, who said, I had no idea what they were calling me about. I mean, particularly two on the same.
Who they were?
It was John Rowe and Tom Sherrard, and they said, "Look, we know that that the company's been acquired, and we don't have any idea what your situation is, but we have been doing some work for Nissan, and this was early in Nissan. The plant was not even completed yet at this time." We're aware right now there's basically one lawyer. There had been a second, but the second lawyer has moved on to something else, and so there's going to be an opening there. And we were asked if we knew of anybody that might be a good fit for the position. And we thought of you, because you have a corporate background, and just wanted to pass this on to you. If you have any interest in it, here's who you write. So I got the name of the general counsel at the plant, and I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I thought, it never occurred to me. So I sent a letter, and a few weeks later I got a phone call asking if I'd like to come down and interview. And the kind of the weird thing about this was that I had actually just come back from Alabama. My mother had some type of a neurological condition that had not been properly diagnosed, but I was a bit down about this. And I almost didn't accept the interview because I was not in a good mood.
This is about 83, 84?
This was in 83, in the spring of 83. And there was a possibility that she had a rather serious neurological condition that would be fatal. It turned out that wasn't what she had. She had a neurological problem, but it wasn't what they initially thought. But I finally said, oh, what the hell, I'll just go for the interview. And I did, and I'm eternally grateful that I did, because I realized that this sounded like an environment I would love to work in. And so I had an initial interview, and then I was asked to come back to interview with some people in the business, on the business side. One interview of which I had that dilemma. The person who was interviewing me kept using a term, and I had no earthly idea what he was talking about. And I was thinking, do I admit to this man I have no earthly idea what he's talking about, or do I just hope that I don't have to reveal my ignorance? And I opted for the latter, and fortunately, I didn't have to reveal my ignorance, and I did get a job offer.
Do you remember what the term was?
It was the FTZ, which I very soon learned stood for Foreign Trade Zone. And I learned a lot about foreign trade zones after I went to work at Nissan, but I had never heard of one before.
Now, I asked you way back when what your starting salary was, and we know that you've now worked for several years for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we know that you worked for NLT, then American General. Do you recall what you started at when you went to Nissan?
I believe that my starting compensation was $50,000.
Oh, now we're moving up.
Yes, I
right.
had moved up a bit.
And they offered you a position as?
At that time, it was associate counsel.
Associate counsel. What were your responsibilities?
Anything that walked in the door.
Was it as hectic as the U.S. Attorney's Office or as hectic as NLT?
No, it was an environment that you never knew what was going to walk into the door. And I had some things that walked into in the door that were quite bizarre, but over the years. But it was a very fast-paced environment.
Let me set the scene a little bit. You used to work at NLT downtown, 7th Avenue.
7th and between Union and Charlotte.
Right. And now you go to work for Nissan, and where is that?
This is at the plant in Smyrna.
And what time did you get up to go to work?
I normally tried to get to work driving to Smyrna by 7:30 or before 8 o'clock.
To get there before 8 o'clock?
Oh, yes, yes.
And what time did you leave?
I had to leave about 7.
And how old was your daughter?
My daughter was 3.
What did you wear to work when you went to Nissan?
Well, it was a very casual environment. In fact, everyone was issued company uniforms, which you did not have to wear. But most people did.
Did you?
And I did. We called them Smurf suits. They were blue pants and a lighter blue shirt that was Smurf blue, and they had our name embroidered on it. It was very convenient when you had people come in from the outside because they immediately knew everybody's name at the table. And the way it was explained to me is they're not mandatory in the office. They were mandatory in the plant. But in the office, it was your decision, but it actually, there were a couple of reasons to do it. One, you might have to go into the plant for something, and you really didn't want to stand out like a sore thumb. It wasn't common, but if there had been an incident that you needed to get a better understanding of, you would go into the plant. The other was that it created a certain amount of a camaraderie with the managers in the plant with whom you worked. And one of the things that I learned over time being there was, first of all, understand this is an industrial plant.
Making? What does it mean?
Making, at that time, we were making pickup trucks.
Did they have the robots at that time?
Oh, yes. It was a highly, highly automated plant. But you still have an awful lot of people who are involved in particularly the final assembly operations.
And how large a plant was it?
Well, the plant itself, when I went, was 3.1 million square feet. It was later expanded to over 5 million square feet. It was big.
How many employees?
When I started, they were just beginning to hire for the second shift. My employee number was 1424, meaning I was the 1424th employee who had been hired in Tennessee. The same day I went in were a whole lot of technicians, the hourly employees who did vehicle assembly. And the initial employees were basically there in management to build the plant, to begin employing, and employment started very heavily in early '83. This was middle of '83, and less than 1,500 employees had been hired. And then over the years, oh my gosh, I don't remember how many employees, between on-site contractors and employees, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000. I mean, by the time, I guess by the early 90s, we had over 5,000 employees, and I talked about I work in a place that has more people in it than the town I grew up in. Now, admittedly, that was on 2 shifts, but still, it was large. But you were working with people whose job was to build cars and trucks and to deal with issues arising out of the plant. And to be perfectly candid, they're a little bit suspicious of lawyers. They kind of look, I mean, there was a joke at NLT that legal departments were sometimes referred to as the Department of Sales Prevention, because your job was to make sure that things were being done in a legally appropriate manner. A little bit different at an industrial plant, but there were still a number of legal issues related to employment issues, the whole method of how you deal with managing employees, what were permissible practices, what weren't. We had environmental issues. We had customs and trade issues. We had contractual issues related to any number of things, purchase of parts, contracts for construction, contracts for equipment, a whole lot of stuff. But in this fast-paced environment, the last thing somebody on the plant floor wants to be told, you can't do that, or you've got to stop doing what you're doing. So you had to develop relationships that allowed you to get in front of problems, as opposed to having to be the person who came in and said, hey, you're doing this all wrong. And fortunately, the management of the plant appreciated that. So at that time, we were a two-person legal department. We grew over time.
When you left, how many were there?
Huh?
How many were there in the legal department when you left?
Well, I've got, because of the corporate relocation, it was much larger. But eventually, the legal department at Smyrna, we had, I guess, 5 lawyers total.
Let's go back. You're starting out. You are finding a different corporate culture than you
Very
had
different.
at
Very
LT.
different.
You're wearing a uniform, going in early. What time did you leave?
Well, it sort of depended on whether or not I had to pick up my daughter. But I usually tried to leave by not a lot after 5. And actually, that usually worked okay because the day shift ended earlier than that. And the important thing was being there when the managers who were responsible for what was going on in the plants were there. So usually leaving by 5 was not a problem. Getting there early was the important thing. And very occasionally, you would be asked to come in to have a joint meeting with people from the night shift. And those meetings were usually at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Now, you started 1983 at Nissan. When did you leave?
Okay, I retired from Nissan in August 1, 2008, but I actually left working at the plant full-time in 2006 when Nissan's corporate headquarters in the U.S. relocated to the Nashville area. And I took over a portion of headquarters work as well as keeping my plant responsibilities. So I split my time between the plant and the headquarters location.
So 1983 to 2008, and I know the last 2 years you were trying to leave and they wouldn't let you leave.
Well, there were a lot of things going on.
There were. But you had, during that time period, several unusual assignments. One had to do with acquisition of another plant.
Well, actually, the development of our plant in Mississippi. That began in 2000, and I was assigned to the negotiating team, and it was an absolutely fascinating project, very fast-paced.
Very secret.
Huh?
Very secret.
Very secret, very secret. And having worked on that type of a project from the inside, I'm always amused when I read about people who are upset about the fact that they don't know where state economic and community development people are traveling, but you have to keep it under wraps. It's just a part of the process. And but there would be days when I would literally leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning, drive to the Smyrna airport, fly on, usually the way it typically worked, we were negotiating with 2 states, with Mississippi and Alabama, for possible sites on a plant. We would typically fly to Jackson. Mississippi would send a plane to pick us up. We'd have our meetings in Jackson, and then we would go to the airport where the Alabama state plane would pick us up and fly us to either Montgomery or to Opelika for meetings there, and then fly us back the next day. And occasionally there would be a one-day trip where you go down and back the same day. But I was putting in a lot of days where I was leaving the house at 6 o'clock in the morning and not getting home until 10 o'clock at night.
And your daughter is how old now?
Well,
She's
by now
20?
she's in college, so...
Not as hard as it was in the
Oh,
early
no,
years.
it would have been very difficult.
Well, let me switch because I know that it was fast-paced and I know it was very secret. I don't want to get into secrets, but you had another interesting experience. You said you never knew what was going to walk in the door. Tell me about the murder at Nissan.
Oh, well, it didn't actually happen at Nissan, but it involved an employee. We had been on our summer shutdown, and normally I would have not even picked up on this in the paper, but for the fact I had, back up just a bit, because of some employee benefits that we had related to company vehicles, lease cars, when an employee filed a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, we became a creditor of our employees. And it was, I mean, it was easy to deal with, but yet we had to stop deducting lease car payments until they got their Chapter 13 plan set up and so forth. And I saw, I'd gotten back from vacation, picked up the Sunday paper, and there was an article about this unidentified body that had been found in North Alabama in a creek entering the Tennessee River, had been identified as a Nashville woman. And it gave the name, and I looked at it, and I said, oh my gosh, that's the same name as that woman that we had this bankruptcy 2 or 3 months ago. It was an unusual name, and I happened to remember it. And so next day was Monday, first day after shutdown, and I got to work, and I found out, yes, indeed, our employee had been murdered. And it was a gruesome murder. It was awful.
She was decapitated?
Yes, she was decapitated. The body was found in a creek that was, it was kind of backed up for the lake near Decatur, Alabama. The head was found separately in the main channel of the Tennessee River. And initially she wasn't identified because difficult to do. Anyway, however, she had been in the military, and they were able to eventually identify her from fingerprints that traced her back to Nashville. And there were, in addition to just the whole, horror of what had happened to this woman, I remembered being a little bit surprised because they were focusing on her husband. And I thought, that's odd, because her bankruptcy was not a couple's bankruptcy. It was an individual bankruptcy. Well, it turned out that she was in the process of getting a divorce, and it was all things were pointing to him. But it got a little bit complicated because, essentially we said, well, look, when we got in, they just said, look, we need to figure out what we need to do here, because she had a lot of optional life insurance. She had opted for not only the basic life insurance that every employee had, but she had purchased the additional group term life insurance. So she had, I don't know, $250,000 to $300,000 worth of life insurance, which was not an insignificant sum. She, of course, had her 401k plan, and what we just said, we need to collect all this information just so that we know what we're dealing with here, because by now it was becoming pretty apparent that the husband was a suspect, and we didn't want to, move too quickly. I mean, typically human resources like to deal with life insurance right away, and it was sort of like, let's slow this down until we can get a better handle on it. Well, what we discovered was she had changed her beneficiary on all of her benefits a couple of months before. Obviously, this tied in with the bankruptcy. She was divorcing him, although the divorce, I don't believe had even, no, I believe the divorce maybe had been filed. I'm not certain whether it had been filed or not. But there was also the little matter of the lease car that she had, which was specific to her. I mean, normally what would happen if an employee died was the surviving spouse could keep the car for a period of time, but they had to make payments, and then we did want the car back. They didn't get to continue to lease indefinitely. So we had to kind of corral all of these benefits. And we were trying to give instructions to human resources about, well, then we discovered that she had changed her beneficiary. And the beneficiary was a person that was described as her brother who lived in Oakland, California. So, somebody said, well, we probably at least need to get in touch with him to let him know that there are these benefits. Someone, I think, actually made a call to his house, was not able to get in touch with him. But they had decided, I think, our HR group, the benefits people, just really did not like dealing with this situation, and so if they would put it off on anybody, they would, and frequently that ended up being the legal department. So I think after they had left the message for the brother to call, when he called, they transferred him to me, and he obviously had gotten word as to what had happened. He had been out of the country and had come back, and and I told him, I just said, well, I know that you've got a lot you want to deal with right now, and I'll never forget this. I said, there are some benefits that we will need to discuss with you at some point, and once you have the opportunity, you do need to get in touch with us, and I'll arrange for our human resources people to explain it to him. He says, well, that can wait. He said, I'm actually taking a flight out tonight to Nashville. I want to find the son of a bitch that did this to my sister. And he said, and I'll get back in touch with you later. I said, okay. And so I thought, okay, this is going to be an interesting one. So a couple of days later, my secretary came from me and she said, someone from the benefits, I can't remember the person from the benefits department, is on the phone, and her husband is on the phone, and she wants to transfer the call up here. I said, okay, all right. So I had a conversation with the husband, and he wanted to know about her benefits. So I got to give him the good news that he wasn't the beneficiary. And I said, there is the matter of the car. We would like our car back. I would appreciate you letting us know when you will be returning it. I remember he threw out all of this. I'm just so upset about this. Now, could I prove that he was faking it? No, I couldn't. But it sure sounded contrived to me. But anyway, I made meticulous notes of this phone call.
Which proved to be of interest later.
It proved to be of interest to the detective who came out to the company to get more information on her and everything that had happened. And so the bottom line was that I found myself, because I had actually talked with the guy, a witness in a murder case. Probably the strangest thing I've ever done in a legal career, but it was definitely interesting.
And why was it so interesting in that murder case?
Well, there were 2 mistrials before he was finally convicted.
What did you learn about the trial judge?
Apparently the trial judge was involved in a relationship with the public defender who was defending him. I felt that there were some odd evidentiary rulings in the case, but when I asked the DA about it, I said, those are some strange evidentiary rulings. He says, you don't know the half of it. He didn't elaborate. I later learned. I did not testify the 3rd trial. I testified in the first.
Who was the judge on the 3rd trial?
I honestly don't remember.
Randall Wyatt.
Okay. I did not know who the judge on the 3rd trial was.
Who was the judge the first 2 times?
Ann Johns.
Ann Lacey Johns.
And
this might be a good time for me just to ask you to recall some of the judges who you held in high esteem and lawyers that you thought highly of. That's something that you acquire after you've been in the legal world for a while. And you've mentioned Judge Gray and Judge Morton.
Right.
Who else stands out over the years that you've gone through, either state or federal, appellate
Oh,
or
gee.
trial, that you kind of look to as people that you hold in high regard?
Oh my gosh. Well, even though I rarely appeared in court after I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you certainly have a feeling for judges in courts where you may have a case, or the company may have a case pending. I actually felt that on the whole, that the Davidson County courts were quite good. There were probably judges that I think were better than others, but on the whole, I think Davidson County had an excellent judiciary. And in fact, after the headquarters move, one of the attorneys who had transferred from California was asking a question about, it was actually a case that was not pending in Nashville, was pending somewhere in East Tennessee, and said something about, well, I'm sure we want to remove to federal court. And I said, you know, don't jump to that conclusion. I said, we have some excellent judges in the state of Tennessee, and I said, I think there's situations in which you really need to think twice about removing a case, because remaining in state court with a really good judge may be the smarter thing to do. I just caution you, I'm not saying that you shouldn't remove in this case, but you need to find out before you have the knee-jerk reaction to remove. And there were actually times where strategically, and I'm probably not saying something that someone wouldn't conclude, but I had a case, obviously I was not trying the case, I had outside counsel involved. It was a dispute where we actually sued an equipment vendor for essentially failure to provide us with the equipment that we had purchased to the tune of some $12 or $15 million. And we had worked with them to try to get them to retrofit the equipment, and they just finally said, we've done everything we're going to do. And our people in the plant were tearing their hair out because they couldn't meet production because the equipment wasn't functioning properly. And so I retained, and they said, well, can we sue them? I said, well, the simple answer is yes, but we need to look at the case. We need to make sure that we've got a case. I mean, because we've got to look at our contract and all that. So I retained an outside law firm to first of all do an examination of our contract and to meet with our people and to decide, do we have a viable case? And after reviewing things and interviewing people at the plant, they came to the conclusion that yes, we have a viable case because of the way the purchase agreement had been written. We had performance specs. And so it's pretty easy to prove that you're not performing. Damage is another issue, but we had a pretty clean case on breach of contract for not providing us the equipment that we had contracted for. And then we talked about, venue for the case. And through an interesting quirk, we discovered our intention was to file in Rutherford County Chancery Court. That happens to be our backyard. And that was not missed on us. But by virtue of some peculiar quirks related to the ownership of the other company, and the fact that at the time we were a Delaware corporation, there was no diversity of citizenship, so they could not remove the case to federal court. They did not want to be in Rutherford County Chancery Court. Anyway, we did have to go through a lot of discovery. We had to spend a lot of money on attorney's fees to get to the point where they were ready to talk settlement, but we did, in fact, settle the case. And it had to do with the fact that they didn't want to try the case in our backyard. So you do learn things like choice of venue can be important. But I do think that Tennessee has, by and large, and I'm not saying that this is 100% across the board, I think Tennessee has a high caliber judiciary, and that I would not automatically jump to say that it's a no-brainer to remove a case. But yeah, I think there are a lot of very, very good judges at actually all levels.
Let me ask, you have had such an interesting career, and this job at Nissan provided you with an opportunity to be a witness in a criminal case. You had the establishment of another plant in another state.
Yeah.
You traveled to Japan. I haven't asked you about your travels.
I did travel some. I think I had 2 trips to Japan. I did not have to travel to Japan a lot. There really wasn't a good reason to do it because our issues were very much focused on what was going on at the plant. I did have one situation. It involved a customs issue related to some of the original equipment that was imported from Japan. And one of our finance managers and I met our outside counsel in Japan to talk with people at the parent, the equipment had been purchased from Nissan Japan, and they were very reluctant to share cost information with us. And we concluded that the only way that we could really get the customs issue resolved was to have a meeting in Japan to convince them that we simply needed to provide this information to the Customs Service, which ultimately our outside counsel was able to convince them to do. We did it. Case was over.
Now, I've asked you about how you were accepted at the various places that you worked. 1983, you go to Nissan. You're one of the few women in the executive suite.
Yes.
How was the reception in 83?
You know, it was actually okay. I actually think that, no, don't get me wrong, an industrial plant is a very macho environment.
I was going to ask you about that.
It's a very macho environment. There were a couple of women. There was one woman who did move up in the human resources department, and then one woman who moved up in manufacturing.
Now you go to Japan. We have you in a very macho working environment, which is a plant making trucks and cars.
Later cars, yeah.
And you are working for a company that is highly structured.
Yes.
A lot of tradition and traditional ways of treating people.
Yeah.
How were you accepted by the ownership?
Well, I would have to say, I mean, Japan was considerably behind the U.S. in terms of women in the workplace. The most interesting thing that happened to me, though, was my first trip to Japan was I didn't really have to do anything. It was a big meeting, and they wanted a representative from the legal department at the plant there. But I just pretty much sat and listened and went out to dinner and, you know, went to these fancy Japanese dinners where you sat on the floor and all of this sort of stuff. It was kind of like a paid vacation, to tell you the truth. But we had a meeting, and in the course of the meeting, there was an issue that had nothing to do with the production issues we were in Japan for, but I was aware of the particular legal issue. And someone came into the room that we were meeting in because one of our liaisons in Nissan's overseas office wanted to meet with me about this issue. Well, the young woman who was sit in just automatically assumed that the engineer who was there with me was who she needed to talk to. And so she went up to him and said something about a meeting with Mr. Shimizu. And he looked at her and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he turned to me, he said, do you know anything about a meeting with Scott Shimizu? I said, oh yeah. And he said, you need to talk to her. And she was dumbstruck because she just assumed that it would be the man, not the woman. but you did run into that. But that had more to do with what the culture in Japan was like. And really, when I met with people who knew why I was there and what I was doing, I think I was treated with respect. But it is a very different culture, particularly as regards women.
How did that change over time? They actually had a new CEO from Brazil?
Yes. Okay.
This is a Japanese
company that okay. In the late 90s, Nissan was in some serious financial trouble. A lot of reasons for it. Not sure I know what all they are, but in essence, the bailout was an investment by the French automaker Renault, who acquired, it was actually a minority interest of Nissan stock, but the important thing was the agreement that Renault basically assumed responsibility for running the company. And they brought in an executive who was Lebanese, but had been raised in Brazil, educated in France, and had worked for a number of years for Michelin, including in the U.S. He left Michelin because Michelin was basically a family-owned company, and he knew that he would never get to the top. He was a very, very bright guy. He went to work for Renault and got assigned to head Nissan. And it was Carlos Ghosn was his name. And he was actually the person who began the project. I mean, he wanted to have the second plant because he believed that the production capacity in the U.S. needed to be increased in order to increase the share of the U.S. market. And so it changed the company radically. And the change just began and continued. Literally, I mean, that is ultimately what caused the headquarters move from the West Coast to here. I would have to say the company is a very different company today than what it was when I was there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's different. Companies evolve over time, and if they don't, they disappear.
Now, how did your legal career impact your family life and social activities that you were engaged in?
Well, it was pretty demanding, and I think it took a toll on my personal life. Not with my daughter, but ultimately with my marriage. Am I sure of that? No, but I think it did take a toll.
And about social activities, you were driving back and forth.
I didn't have a whole lot of a social life, and particularly when I was spending a lot of long hours. And once my daughter, got beyond, the age where she had to be picked up at school, things got busy at work. I did travel some. I traveled to California quite a bit when the headquarters was there because we began merging benefit plans and trying to operate more as a single company as opposed to a bunch of little separate companies. This was a part of the direction with the Renault investment.
What would you say are the rewards and disadvantages of a legal career?
I think the rewards are, I think that it can be an extremely interesting career. Disadvantages, that's a little bit hard for me to say. I do think that the legal landscape for employment has changed pretty dramatically. And my niece has just graduated from law school at Vanderbilt. And I have to say that her experience has been so different from mine in very, very many respects. But while she's going to be going with a law firm in New York, I think she already realizes this may not be something that she stays with for her entire career.
Do you have any idea how many women were in her class in law school?
I don't know how many, but it was a lot. I don't know if it was 50%, but it had to be close if it wasn't.
And how would you describe the role of lawyers today and the law firms in the future? Or corporate counsel in the future, which is what you did?
I think in law firms, again, I'm looking at this from the outside, never having been in a law firm, but having worked with a lot of law firms. I think a big difference in the law firm environment today as opposed to when I got out of law school was when I got out of law school, people went into a law firm with the idea that it would be a career at that firm. That did begin to change. Today, it is my sense that very few young lawyers go into firms believing that that is going to be their career for life. I think they recognize that it's a very fluid environment.
What about corporate lawyers?
Corporate, I think there is a little more stability in the corporate world. In fact, I think the whole corporate legal department has changed pretty dramatically. There was a perception back, I think, even when I was in law school, and perhaps to a degree after I finished law school, that the corporate world was just a gravy train, that it was just an easy job, an inside job with no heavy lifting, so to speak. But it offered some stability and some benefits, but there was actually a view that lawyers in corporate legal departments were not practicing law. And in fact, that was a position that was challenged by a corporate attorney who came to Nashville with, I don't remember what company, and when he applied for admission to practice in Tennessee, they were told, well, you're not eligible because you're not practicing law, you're in a corporation. Well, that rule got changed. The reality is you are practicing law in a corporation. You probably aren't doing trial work, although there are corporations in which lawyers do trial work. But you are very much practicing law. I think that a corporate environment is frequently perhaps a little more stable than a law firm environment today. You don't have the business development aspect. You do have to learn how to function in the corporate world. And that first involves an understanding that the decisions are not made by lawyers. They're made by business people with, we hope, legal advice. But just because something is the best way to do something legally doesn't mean that they have to do it. Now, you do have some obligations. You can't let them do something criminal. You do have an obligation to stop that. But a business person is entitled to make a risky legal choice. It's your job to make sure they're aware of the ramifications of what they're doing. But and my belief is that to be effective in a corporation, you really do have to understand the business of the company. And you do need to you've got to make friends with the people you're working with because you want them coming to you before they make the decision and not after there's a problem. And I still have many, many close friends that I worked with at the company. In fact, we have a retiree group. We get together and have lunch periodically, and we stay in touch. But I developed close friendships with some of the people in the plant, and I think, in a way, one of the greatest compliments I was ever paid by one of the guys in the plant was we had a bad hire in the legal department. Won't get into details, but it was somebody that just did not work out. Left under a cloud. It was a very unfortunate situation all around. It was not the right job for him. He wasn't the right fit for us. But it happened very suddenly. And I got a call from one of my colleagues who was a manager in the plant. And he said, Martha, he said, I want to tell you something. He said, there are rumors all over the plant about the person who just left. He said, and the rumors include he wasn't even a lawyer, which was not true. He said, y'all really need to get in front of this and set this straight because we just need to stop the rumors. And I told him, I said, listen, I appreciate that. I will get this word up, and we will definitely get the appropriate communications out to management. I said, it's happened pretty fast, and we probably should have anticipated that the rumor mill would start working overtime, but we didn't. But he said, I just want to tell you something else. He said, those of us in the plant are glad he's gone. He said, we could not stand working with him because he acted like he was better than us. And he said, we know you guys have more education than we do. And, you know, you have a different type of work than we do. But he said, we don't like being talked down to. And he said, we love working with you. You're one of us. And we feel like we can tell you anything, and that you're not going to throw us under the bus.
The highest of compliments.
And I just said, well, I appreciate you telling me that, and we'll try to make sure that we keep that in mind when we hire again. But it was truly one of the best compliments I ever got, because these are people who don't inherently like lawyers. They're not necessarily comfortable dealing with lawyers, but it's important that they be able to work with us.
Well, let me ask you a few questions as we wrap up. You retired 2008.
Yep.
Seems like just yesterday.
I know.
What are your current activities?
Well, actually, it's amazing. I don't know how I had time to work. It's really funny. After I retired, I mean, I had given it a lot of thought, and there were several things that made me, I had some benefits that allowed me to retire early, and in other circumstances I couldn't have, but I was able to financially, and I had a lot of great projects. We had just finished, I mean, I had started talking with my boss about retiring about a year before I actually did. But I had decided the best time to retire was going to be when the company moved to the new headquarters in Franklin. That way, if they wanted to do reorganization in the department, it made it just a little bit, you know, more logical and that kind of thing. It didn't happen quite as soon as I had hoped it would, but that had been my thought, that it was a good time. And personally, my mother had died in 2007 after a pretty steady decline of from the neurological condition that couldn't be diagnosed in 1983, but it eventually, a lot of things caught up with her. And my father was still in pretty good shape, although he was by now 87 years old, and still in reasonably decent shape, although he was not physically very mobile. And I knew that it would be nice to be able to have a lot more freedom to spend time with him. I mean, we had a caregiver that lived with him. He could not live alone, but it was just a good time. And so in addition to becoming involved in a couple of not-for-profits, I continued to be a member of the, it's now called Workforce Development Board, which I had been on before I retired. I thought they would want me to resign, but they said if you'd like to stay on, we'd kind of like you to think about becoming involved in our youth programs, which I did. and continue to be today. I was invited to join the board of Tennessee, that time Tennessee Repertory Theater, now Nashville Repertory Theater. We changed the name to make it a little bit more relevant to Nashville. I became much more involved in the Lawyers Association for Women, which was something I had just never been able to be involved in when I was working in Smyrna. It just wasn't in the cards. But I'd become, with headquarters downtown, I was able to begin going to meetings and got involved and served on the board for a few years, and I continue to be active on a committee, actually working with the LAW archives. So and then I've traveled. I've been able to travel quite a bit since I retired, and which has been a lot of fun.
Well, as a final question, let me ask you. You mentioned how you felt after you got out of law school and were having problems finding a job as a lawyer. The final question is, would you recommend a legal career to a young person today?
Yes, but with some caveats. And in fact, I had this discussion with my niece before she entered law school, is that it can be an extremely rewarding career. But I think you need to think about what do you want to do, and do the opportunities that the law provides today give you the type of career that you would like. I think it's a matter, I think the other thing, and I told her this, that law can prepare you for a career other than law. Legal training actually has a lot of utility outside of practicing law. And I think that's becoming more and more true today. And I think that when she made the decision to go to law school, what she was wrestling with was, she was living in Berlin at the time, and she had gotten a master's degree. She was finishing a master's degree at the Free University, at Freie Universität in Berlin, and was trying to weigh continuing in an academic realm or doing something that would be not in academia. And she pretty much decided that academia was not what she wanted. And I think that she saw law as being something that offered her the opportunity to go in any of several directions. She is very fortunate in that she speaks 3 languages, fluent in German. She calls herself conversational in Spanish, but most people would call her fluent in Spanish. She is extremely interested in international work. In fact, she is going with a British-based firm and will be working in the international law arena. I would not be surprised to see her leave private practice at some point and go into possibly some type of government work or international business. But I think that she realized that the law school education could provide a platform that had utility beyond practicing law. And I think that's actually something that's important for any person considering entering law school to know, is that you're not, I mean, my perception was entering law school is you're going to practice law. I didn't really think about what other types of careers legal training could be appropriate for. And I think that that's something that any student should keep in mind now.
And I think your career demonstrates that. Martha, thank you so much.
We're done?